Good morning. My name is Jake Kurtzer. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. For those of you watching online, welcome to CSIS Online. And thanks again for joining us. Some of y'all were here yesterday for day one of our conference, but we're really excited to kick off the second day of the Sustaining Access Conference, talking about refining humanitarian principles, humanitarian practice, and humanitarian policy for today's humanitarian challenges. We have a great day ahead of us, but I'm particularly excited about this morning's opening session. Yesterday at this conference, we talked a lot about some countries where we're experiencing real access challenges: Ukraine, Afghanistan, the Sahel, and we talked a little bit about some of the broader strokes thematic issues, and one in particular, the challenge of the ongoing existing counterterrorism regulations and bureaucratic impediments imposed by a counterterrorism framework. Within the context of that conversation, the key issue is how do humanitarians and the community around them engage with those groups that are designated as terrorist, and how do humanitarians engage with non-traditional or non-state armed groups? So we're really excited for this morning's opening session. We have one of the world's leading experts on the topic, and to introduce her, I want to invite up my colleague, Nicole Amdahl, to introduce and moderate our conversation.
Good morning and welcome on behalf of CSIS again to everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this very important conversation. My name is Nicole Breland Amdahl. For our Norwegian friends, yes, Andalnes, Norway. That's not my home, but it's my last name. And I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker this morning, Lise Grand, who has 25 years in humanitarian and peacekeeping experience, and she was one of the most senior negotiators with the United Nations. And what's really interesting is she did this work through 12 wars. So we are exceptionally pleased to have her here to give some opening remarks, and then we will have a discussion and some Q&A. So welcome, Lise.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to have been invited to be part of this discussion. What I'd like to do in my brief presentation this morning are two things. First of all, to chart some of the milestones in the evolution of humanitarian negotiations with non-state armed actors, and second, to reflect on the perils of these negotiations. To frame the conversation, it might be useful to begin with a working definition. It's used by most humanitarians of what a non-state armed group actually is. So, non-state armed groups are fighting forces with political or military influence. They are not states, and their levels of organization and leverage differ hugely. NSAGs range from small groups of armed men loosely formed in a militia, for example, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, who raid villages and prey on travelers on isolated roads, to complex political religious movements, for example, in Yemen, like Ansar Allah, which control much of the country and population, function openly through state ministries, and have formalized armed structures and armed forces of their own. The ICRC, which tracks NSAGs and monitors their actions, has identified more than 600 of these groups operating across the world. So humanitarians engage with NSAGs for one of three reasons. First, to reach and assist people in need. That's humanitarian access. Second, to protect and preserve humanitarian operations in a shared operating environment. That's humanitarian space. They're not the same thing. And third, to protect civilians and promote respect for international humanitarian law. During the past 25 years, humanitarian negotiations with NSAGs have fallen into four basic categories. The first type of negotiation took shape at the end of the Cold War. They're known as negotiated access frameworks. These mechanisms are typically negotiated by the UN. They include all of the belligerent parties to a conflict, and they specifically define the role and posture of humanitarian actors. The aim of a negotiated access framework is to obtain broad, formal commitment to the components of a humanitarian operation. Those components, of course, would be assessment, delivery, coordination, monitoring, and if you're very lucky, accountability. The thing about an access framework, however, is that they do not usually include the specific modalities for each of these components. So how you assess is almost never included inside of an access framework. How you deliver aid, these are not specified. This has been one of the weaknesses of these frameworks. In some cases they do, but that's the exception. One of the earliest and most comprehensive and enduring access framework, Operation Lifeline Sudan, known as OLS. This was a compact that was negotiated, in fact, before the Cold War ended. It was negotiated by Jim Grant from UNICEF during the devastating famine in the Bahr Ghazal region of Sudan. It was signed. It was a formal agreement that was signed by the government of Sudan and by the non-state armed group, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. The OLS framework had three elements. It defined the conditions and terms under which humanitarian action would occur in Sudan. Defined those. Based on these conditions, these terms, belligerents promised to ensure unhindered access. So if the conditions and terms were in place, there was unhindered access. It did something else very interesting. It committed humanitarians to remain strictly neutral during the delivery of aid. It did not assume that humanitarians on their own would be neutral. I'm going to pause there because obviously many humanitarians now insist that by definition they are neutral. Negotiated access frameworks did not assume that. They specified the conditions under which that neutrality would be upheld. The OLS framework was amended several times during its 16 years of existence. There is no other access framework that has lasted longer. Each time that it was amended, the scope of humanitarian action was expanded. It eventually included coordination. It included accountability as components. And by the end of the 16 years, you actually did have modalities specified inside of the compact to prevent diversion and ensure that assistance was needs-based. Now, following a series of violations by the non-state armed group, that was the SPLM, this occurs in the mid-1990s, the UN negotiated, and here's where the trouble begins, a separate formal agreement with the rebels. So you had one access framework that brought everybody together, and then the UN did something very curious. It said, actually what we're going to do is negotiate a separate agreement with the non-state armed group. That was called the ground rules. From the start, they were controversial. Now, the ground rules had two aims when they were negotiated. There was an attempt to formally bind this non-state armed group to IHL. Second, the ground rules were meant to establish a structure for relations between aid agencies and the non-state armed group. And again, the difference here is in an access framework, those relations are contained for all belligerents in one agreement. What happens under the ground rules is that the UN says we're going to have a separate formal signed agreement with the non-state actor for the ground rules just for them. It was this second aspect that opened up a can of worms. During the negotiations, here's what the SPLM said. They said, you want us to uphold our obligations, Under IHL, we can't. We don't have the capacity to do that. So, humanitarians, you want access to the areas we control? You give us direct material support in the form of administrative capacity building to do that. The humanitarian negotiators agreed. Now, the government of Sudan was shocked by this development, and they argued direct administrative support enhances the overall effectiveness of this non-state armed group as a military body. And therefore, humanitarians, this violates your principle of neutrality. Now, there were parts of the humanitarian community and many within the UN who understood the risks associated with the ground rules. That said, they were not changed, and the UN ended up providing substantial material administrative support to the SPLM, a non-state armed group, for more than a decade. There was a second problem with the ground rules. This was unintended, but it had an incentivizing effect on other non-state armed groups, which said, we're not going to allow humanitarians into our areas unless the UN signs a separate agreement with us. Within a year, there was a splintering of the SPLM. A second ground rules had to be signed with this second SPLM group. And within 3 years, again, the SPLM had split, and you had a third ground rules. Although very difficult to manage and frequently criticized, as I said, Operation Lifeline Sudan lasted for 16 years until a comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the government of Sudan and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in 2005. Now, throughout this period, OLS remained a center of gravity. Almost all humanitarian negotiations, excepting, of course, the ICRC, with non-state armed groups, and they kept proliferating, was done on the basis of the original OLS agreement, and then after 1995 on the basis of first ground rules, second ground rules, third ground rules. Although humanitarian organizations could choose to negotiate with the SPLM and these other groups outside of OLS, relatively few did. And this ensured a level of coherence in assistance and protection, and leverage from principles were violated that at the time was unprecedented. Now, the second type of negotiation are what are called emergency response plans. And by the mid-1990s, so 5 years after the end of the Cold War, many humanitarian country teams, in fact, more than 50% of all of the HCTs at the time were using the framework established by ERPs to set the terms and conditions for humanitarian action in a country on a 12-month period. ERPs were for 1 year. They were far less formal than the signed access frameworks. So a framework, an access framework is actually signed by a party. ERPs were not. They were less formal. They had the advantage of structuring relations with a non-state armed group by setting out in detail the actual modalities, the machinery of humanitarian action. They spelled out how assessments would be done, the methodology. They spelled out the mechanisms for delivery, and they spelled out protocols for monitoring. So if you look at the evolution, you have an access framework, which is a broad commitment, formally signed. You move to an ERP, which has detailed modalities for the actual components of what you're doing, and it's less formal. The shift from access frameworks to the ERPs was driven, at least in part, by concerns that formal agreements like OLS and the ground rules conferred legitimacy on the non-state armed groups and pulled humanitarians into the political orbit of those groups. ERPs, on the other hand, avoided this risk by being fully and only humanitarian in character. A particularly good example, the textbook example of the ERP approach was, of course, in Angola, where the UN, on behalf of humanitarians, negotiated ERPs on an annual basis with the government of Angola on the one hand, and with UNITA, the main non-state armed group in the country, on the other. Angola's ERPs included fully structured access protocols. People who study access protocols, that's your textbook. They defined the types of protection and assistance and the conditions under which they would be delivered. Very interestingly, small teams of humanitarian negotiators working on behalf of the humanitarian country team were deployed directly into conflict areas, engaging directly with commanders on the ground to ensure that the modalities in that ERP were respected. So you had an ERP, it said this is how assessments are going to be done, and you had teams of humanitarian negotiators on the lines with the commander saying, it's in the ERP. This is what you have to do. These teams were fully accepted as neutral actors by all parties, and they were empowered to negotiate cross-line convoys. Here's the government, here's UNITA. They were on the line negotiating cross-line convoys. Who does that now? And cross-line corridors, replacing the chaotic and unsuccessful attempts of individual organizations to negotiate access with UNITA. The third category of negotiations are joint operating principles. These are informal statements. They often include a combination of intention, of aspiration, and affirmations of broad principles. They are only, in fact, rarely, the result of direct negotiations with belligerents. Much more often, they are based on consultations between humanitarians. Humanitarians draft these things. Worse examples are when the IASC gets involved with it. When you have the IASC in headquarters drafting a set of joint operating principles for a country somewhere else. After those negotiations are done, then someone goes and presents these to the belligerents. That's not negotiations, that's a fait accompli. Now, JOPs are increasingly popular, not least because they're relatively easy to elaborate. They do not require the skills necessary to negotiate with sophisticated senior belligerent leaders. And here's the worst part of a JOP. They exercise little, in fact, basically no pressure on the belligerents. In many contexts, however, humanitarians feel that JOPs are the most pragmatic form of engagement now with the non-state actor, even if they produce suboptimal results. The Democratic Republic of Congo illustrates this well. The UN estimates right now there are more than 100 different armed groups that are operating in the DRC, many of whom have unclear, if any, political aims, and many have open or clandestine relationships with national actors. Humanitarians have a very difficult time dealing with the opaque nature of these groups, their highly localized presence, the lack of unified command, and legendary ill discipline. Although efforts have been made to structure relations with these multiplicity of non-state armed groups, the reality, for those of us who have worked in Congo, is that even when they are in place, access remains highly restricted. and it requires exhaustive negotiations with low-level commanders in every single village. If you're lucky enough to get an agreement with one of those commanders, they are almost always repudiated when a new commander comes in. A fourth relatively new form of engagement with non-state armed groups are risk frameworks. These are difficult to put in place and very difficult to negotiate. But humanitarians have started to use these in situations where a non-state armed group is in effect a state actor. This is currently the case in Afghanistan and, of course, in Yemen. Both countries face some of the world's worst humanitarian conditions, and in both countries, humanitarians are forced to engage with non-state authorities who see themselves as sovereign and, for all intents and purposes, exercise full sovereign power, but are not recognized as being legitimately sovereign by anybody else. Risk frameworks are real-time accountability mechanisms that are used to modulate the flow of assistance to reflect the real-time actual conditions on the ground. Here's how they work. You establish a clear risk threshold. Humanitarians define those. It's not negotiated. WFP says, if this threshold is breached, we cannot deliver food assistance. When a threshold is breached, assistance is ramped down till you reach an acceptable level of risk. Now, that ramping down step is taken immediately when a risk threshold is breached. Hard part comes in when you're negotiating the steps. You do this with the belligerents to get the risk level to an acceptable higher level so that you can ramp up assistance. Now, this is not a one-way street. There are steps that a belligerent can take to reach an acceptable risk level. There are steps humanitarians can take. It's shared accountability. Now, once you get back to an acceptable level, up goes the assistance. So assistance is modulated based on acceptable levels of risk. Now, these require very high order, extremely sophisticated negotiations. It's a skill set many humanitarians, let's be honest about ourselves, really don't have. This is where you want your trade negotiators in there. Why? Because you first have to explain to the belligerents what the risk threshold is. Not exactly a straightforward conversation. And then when that threshold is breached, the negotiations become very tricky because the belligerents are going to say, humanitarians, you take the steps that are necessary to get to an acceptable level. We're saying to the belligerents, you take those steps, and the point is we both have to find a way to do that. As you would imagine, the pressure on the humanitarians by a non-state armed group, which is all intents and purposes sovereign, are extreme. That's what I'm saying. You got to really know what you're doing. Because you essentially have a non-state armed group with full state authority negotiating with you. What I'd like to do now is shift and reflect on 4 of the many perils humanitarians face when they engage with non-state armed groups. The first peril is the legitimization of armed groups. Sometimes this legitimization comes in the form of giving the armed group international visibility and informal recognition by virtue of the fact that negotiations are even occurring with them. Other times it occurs when the armed group takes credit for delivering help to people, solidifying a social compact with the communities they control. An example of the first is OLS, which contributed to the SPLM, evolving from being localized bands of armed rebels into a structure-capacitated, internationally recognized liberation movement that successfully divided Africa's largest country into two states, one of which they took control over. An example of the second is Yemen. At the height of the world's worst famine, Ansar Allah demanded that food assistance be delivered through its Ministry of Education. Although WFP put in place mechanisms to try and limit diversion and ensure that the aid reached children in need, Ansar Allah falsely announced that these were their deliveries through their Ministry of Education. They lied to the population about mistakes that WFP was making, saying WFP isn't delivering to you directly, we are, through our Ministry of Education. And they claimed credit for a political promise they had made to the population to deliver free school meals, something the population had been demanding for years. The second peril in negotiating with non-state armed groups is violating the principle of neutrality. This includes building the administrative capacity of a non-state armed group in the expectation that it will do a better job of coordinating with us. An example of this, as we talked about, are the ground rules that were negotiated with the SPLM, which included training on the administrative functions that could be used to increase the overall effectiveness of their military campaign. The third peril is the risk of politicizing humanitarian assistance. This is a very common problem, particularly in UN special and peacekeeping missions, where senior UN political officials negotiate humanitarian corridors and ceasefires as confidence-building measures between rebels and state actors. As soon as the special representative says to the humanitarians, don't you think it's a good idea for us to build confidence through a humanitarian gesture? No, it's not. It means they're not good enough to do their job, to get those belligerents to agree to the political conditions for ending hostilities. They piggyback on the humanitarians. Now, these efforts are very often praised for laying the groundwork for political negotiations. Listen to what's said in the UN Security Council. You will hear this on a regular basis. But the reality is that a political negotiator is using humanitarian assistance to advance a political agenda. This happens a lot. In Yemen, for example, the UN's envoy, he is now, I point this gently, the head of humanitarian action for the United States. I'm talking about the same person. He's a friend. He negotiated a humanitarian ceasefire in the port of Hodeidah as a confidence-building measure between the parties. Now, that ceasefire broke down very quickly. And when it did, humanitarians were denied access to essential humanitarian infrastructure in the ceasefire zone. Breaks down, we can't get there anymore. Those were the Red Sea mills, and we depended on them to get food to people who were going to die in the famine if we didn't. This was done in retaliation by Ansar Allah for the political actions of the other party. Fourth peril derives from the very nature of non-state actors. By definition, non-state armed groups operate beyond the rule of law. This means that they frequently undervalue or violate commitments they have entered into. There's the additional problem that a number of non-state armed groups are listed under anti-terrorist legislation, opening humanitarian negotiators to prosecution unless waivers are obtained. We also should be absolutely clear that the aims of non-state armed groups are rarely aligned with humanitarian aims, making engagement with them adversarial in nature. Non-state armed groups want to control and profit from humanitarian aid and to use it for their own advantage. They want to profit from humanitarian assistance not to ensure that it reaches people on the basis of principles that they themselves may not necessarily ascribe to. Humanitarians, on the other hand, want unimpeded access. We want non-interference. We want respect for those international principles and international humanitarian law. In reality, neither party usually gets what they want, and you end up with a negotiated compromise. To ensure that that negotiated outcome favors humanitarians, engagement with the groups has to be strategic, planned, disciplined, and it's got to be principled. And the question is, how do you do that? I think there are multiple types of frameworks that engage and bind non-state actors. We've just talked about 4 of them. But what is key to the success of negotiating, whether it's an access framework, whether it's a joint operating principle, or whether it's a risk framework, what is key is an empowered humanitarian coordinator. These are negotiators who represent the entire humanitarian community. They ensure cohesion within that community, and here's the key point. They are authorized to leverage the bargaining power of that community during negotiations with the non-state armed group. That minimizes the risk that a non-state armed group can divide and instrumentalize individual humanitarian organizations. That's why you want an empowered coordinator. Empowered coordinators, however, are only as strong as the secretariats that support them. For many years, OCHA performed that role, and before OCHA, for those of us who are of an elderly age, it was the Department of Humanitarian Assistance, DHA. Several years ago, as we all know, OCHA offices were realigned to become a staff function of the Emergency Response Coordinator in New York. OCHA field teams shifted from defending humanitarian action in support of their humanitarian country team to focusing on procedural and transactional headquarters priorities. This was regrettable and can hopefully be changed. 2 final thoughts. For many years, humanitarian engagement has been shaped by a relatively small group of activist organizations that have benefited not from universal acceptance of IHL, but from the strong support of leading countries in the United Nations. And not even the preponderance of countries, quite a small group of them. With the balance of global power now changing, we should be ready for new perspectives on how humanitarian principles are shaped and defended and actualized across the world. This little club that we've been in is changing. Already, for example, we see efforts to embed concepts of non-interference as a form of neutrality into humanitarian frameworks. Now, I think everyone knows what I'm talking about here. You've got a major global power who says neutrality is in fact non-interference. Now, humanitarians by definition show up in someone else's country and say, we're actually going to do things in your country. Don't worry, it's on the basis of principles. That's what we call neutrality. No, something else is going on here. You have a major global power that says neutrality is in fact non-interference. If you're not worried about that, start to panic. The humanitarian stakes are very high, as we all know. In less than 2 years, 500,000 people are estimated to have died in the conflict in Tigray. Now, organizations which track this estimate that 300,000 of the 500,000 people who died because they didn't have us. They didn't have humanitarian assistance. Despite the best efforts of the teams on the ground, none of the existing humanitarian, diplomatic, or economic tools, we all tell ourselves we have lots of tools, they were all applied in Tigray, and none of them resulted in predictable access. So of course the tragedy in Tigray is going to become the norm unless we figure out how to adapt our engagement strategies to fit the new realities in a very different balance of global power. I'd like to thank the Center for Strategic International Studies, USAID, and the Norwegian Refugee Council for allowing me to share these thoughts with you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. That was absolutely eye-opening and really incredible discussion. I learned a lot. And I want to kind of dig into some of the things that you brought up during the conversation, and I have a couple that are, a little bit tangential, but I think also could lead a little bit to some more clarity in some areas. And the first question I have is a little bit practical. And so you spoke to, the negotiations, the shifting platform, different players. So what does that negotiation look like? How do you structure how you engage? And, I'm presuming it requires a lot of agility and adaptability to, changing circumstances. But to that end, also, then what does the accountability structure look like in that type of environment?
So, there are a number of very useful manuals. OCHA produces them, a number of humanitarian organizations do. ICRC probably has the best one that suggests how you negotiate. So as one of the long-lasting negotiators in the UN on humanitarian assistance, I've read all of them. And frankly, I'm not sure I would have known what to do if that resource had been the only inputs I had. So I think the key, frankly, to humanitarian negotiation is knowing how to negotiate on your back foot. So when you go into negotiations as a humanitarian, you really don't have a lot of leverage or power. You have the most power if there is a major member state that has a lot of influence over the non-state armed groups. That's really where your leverage comes from. You have additional leverage if the humanitarian community, sans ICRC, because they're never part of it, if they're basically with you, you've got more leverage. But even in those situations, you're still on your back foot. You are guests in these countries. You have a status which is based on an abstract principle, but depends upon them legally allowing you to be there. So the best negotiators are those who know how to negotiate from a position of weakness. So if I were running a humanitarian organization, I'd call the trade unions. Trade union negotiators, almost always, are negotiating from a position of weakness vis-a-vis management. When I first started coming up through the UN, there was a small group of, we were all in DHA at the time, of frontline humanitarian negotiators. There were 13 of us, 7 of us came from the unions. So I think that, in addition to all the manuals that are helpful for setting guidelines, the real issue is, can you leverage what leverage may be there, whether it's a member state or the cohesion of the international community, and can you negotiate from a position of weakness? And if you can do that, you're probably going to be better off than if you don't. What doesn't work is if you come from a very rich country And you just think if you show up and you tell the non-state armed groups to do something, that they will miraculously understand that they're supposed to and do it. That doesn't work. Look at the profile of many humanitarian coordinators, and the point rests.
So, in addition to the work you have to do in country, there are a number of external forces putting pressure on the means and the how and the why. So, what are the means for navigating that type of pressure, be it political, it's donor objections, and even multilateral and unilateral sanctions?
That's why you need a good OCHA. That's why you need an OCHA team that works for the HCT. Because who really handles most of that pressure, keeps track of it, negotiates it, sets it to right, are the OCHA teams. What really dealt a knockout blow to much of the humanitarian negotiation that was going on through the early knots and the mid-knots was when OCHA shifted. Because the humanitarian coordinator can't do all of that. Not a chance. It's got to be the OCHA teams that do that. But if the OCHA team is focused on what's, these transactional, procedural, there are a lot of people glaring at me, you must all work for OCHA. If you're all focused on those, then you're not supporting your HC on the, more importantly, your HCT on the ground.
That makes sense. So I want to go back to this discussion on legitimization, particularly if you're looking at an ends focus rather than the means. And you spoke about the work in Sudan specifically. So as I'm listening to this, I'm wondering, is there a bright line for that type of support? Does it depend on the non-state actor? And then, I want to ask about that first, and I have kind of a follow-on question to that.
So non-state armed groups that have aspirations for international visibility, legitimization, and an expectation that they could take, that they could play a recognized political role in their country, if not control the country. Watch out. Be very aware. In a case like Congo, where you have 100 armed groups, many of which do not have clear political aims, it's a different situation than where you had an SPLM that said, we want the country to break up and we want our own. In a situation like that, any step you take, keep your eyes wide open for the risk of legitimizing those claims through humanitarian action. If you want to legitimate them politically, don't be a humanitarian. There's an argument to do that. Just don't pretend you're a humanitarian. But if you want to maintain humanitarian integrity, then you've got to draw that line between them. The reason that as soon as the ground rules were signed with the SPLM, Riek Machar, who at the time had broken off from the SPLM and was running SSIM, he said, I want one of those ground rules agreements, because this would, of course, give his movement the visibility that he craved to advance his political agenda. And then Lam McCall, as soon as the ink was dry on the second agreement, said, actually, I'm going to splinter off from SPLM because I'm very angry at John Garang. I'm going to create SPLM United, and I want that visibility that the ground rules give. So I think in a situation where the political aims of the non-state armed group are explicitly statehood in nature, proceed with due caution. In the case of Congo, it's different. Many of those organizations, if not the majority, do not have the same kind of clear state-directed ambitions.
Right. And then just a final question before we open it up to the audience for questions. I'm just curious, to you, what does success look like? And is that, a ta-da moment, or is it more of a way to measure incrementally what you want these outcomes to achieve over time?
So The point about success in a humanitarian context is that you are constantly able, in a principled way, to get assistance to people who aren't going to make it without you. That's your job. And you have success measured every day on whether you succeed in doing that or not. Success never comes in the form of we've reached an agreement on an access framework, done. Never. So that's step one, and then every day in every location where there are people who need assistance in order to survive, you have to make sure that it reaches the people in need in a timely fashion so they make it to the next day. So success is in fact not punctual. It is a continual commitment to upholding a set of principles under the most unimaginable conditions, because if we fail, then people die, as we saw in the case of Tigray. Stakes are very high.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions. There should be microphones, or speak in a commanding voice.
If you work for OCHA, you're not allowed to ask me anything.
There's a gentleman right there next to you.
Please, hi. Well, first of all, thanks for your opening comments. I mean, they're clearly built on years of experience, and I really appreciated your candor and your honesty. I fully agree of the role of an empowered HC. You were an empowered HC. I think rather than being given the power, you took the power very clearly, certainly in South Sudan and Yemen and places like that. And also on negotiations. Also, I think you touched on something. I was part of the mission that went into Haiti recently, the EDG, looking at what could be done in relation to, in a political vacuum, but where ganglands are basically running not just the city, but the wider part of the country. And a key issue came up was this issue of legitimization, and also the fact that the gangs were using whatever assistance was coming in to say to the communities, you see how we are the ones. So they have a political agenda. It's a very confused agenda, but they have that. I guess I'm coming to the question in some ways. The three key things I think that were essential were to try and integrate protection, which is a major issue in there, with service delivery, okay, which certainly Concern is doing, because doing protection on its own is probably not viable. But the second and the more hot topic was around the word of negotiation with gangs for entry. The HC in there had refused, my understanding, to negotiate directly for fear of legitimization, but encourage negotiation through at different levels within that. And that seemed to be successful up to a point. But I guess I'm curious to know, at the political level, there has been no response from the Security Council in relation to this international specialized force that was asked for. And no response is probably worse than a no. And there's a big debate going on about whether we should be strengthening the national police. Nobody wants to go back to peace building. There's other issues around trying to control the arms flow, some of which is coming in from the US, at least trying to tackle that. But where do you put diplomacy and the external diplomacy, which seems to be on the wane, as part of your negotiations as a contributing factor? I'm not seeing in the last number of years that diplomacy has the same robust attention that has been given. And it's the one thing that didn't seem to get discussed around international diplomacy. The last point I'll make is we had two presidents in Northern Ireland, where I'm from, visiting for a population of 1.4 million to mark the 25 years of the peace agreement. That's an extraordinary amount of attention for a very small conflict, which does indicate that that level of attention is required elsewhere. But the three things that contributed to that were external engagement, US included, the engagement of local groups, community groups, and the third and critical one was having women at the negotiation table. So back into the diplomacy question, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that can fold into your negotiation strategy.
So when humanitarians coordinators themselves get together and they're trying to explain to each other what they should be doing, the piece of advice is know the strong member state that has control over your belligerents. And develop a deep and meaningful relationship with that member state. So if you're in CAR, have the telephone numbers for Paris. When we were in South Sudan together, we had the telephone numbers of Addis and Washington. Because what you did was you called them and you said, I'm really stuck and they're stealing all of WFP's food, and can you call someone and help us out here and make it clear that that's got to stop. When you get to a place like Yemen, or you're in Kabul right now, who do you call? And as we see the fragmentation of the global good, which is peace and security, which, for Frank, was an American contribution through overwhelming military superiority in every single weapon system in every single domain. Right? That global good set some pretty strong parameters that allowed a handful of countries for the last 80 years to exert disproportionate influence on other actors. That's all breaking down. And I think we have to face the fact that not only are we going to have a lot more Afghanistans and Yemens where you just don't have anyone to call that's prepared to exercise influence, it will also mean that a number of actors whose decisions about how they were behaved were shaped by the global good, which was a framework for peace and security provided and paid for by the United States of America, when that no longer is the sine qua non upon which all of this is based, boy, you could have a whole lot of actors behaving in a way like we're seeing in parts of the Sahel. That you mentioned Haiti, a very specific case of where you have a complete breakdown of state authority in a context of regional realignment. I think we have to be prepared for the fact that that's probably the new norm. The role of diplomacy, is it diplomacy or pressure? Because the example I gave you was pressure. All right, a member state calls CAR, calls Bangui, and says, I'm not sure that's quite diplomacy, but it was certainly the basis upon which many operations of our generation depended.
Let's go here first. Then we'll move over.
Do you believe there is a genuine intent within the humanitarian community to achieve the quality of access, humanitarian structure that you've defined in your remarks that would allow us to negotiate for humanitarian access? And if not, are we more focused on other things like competition with each other for funds, et cetera? And if so, how do we hold ourselves accountable for that?
One of the very interesting features of the early negotiated access frameworks was they did not assume that humanitarians on their own acted in a neutral way. And the belligerents said, if we're going to give you unhindered access, then we want guarantees, promises that you're going to behave a certain way. And of course, that's now petered off. You almost never see this anymore, where humanitarians will be very clear about the commitments and promises that they made and how they will actualize them. In terms of, do I think that there's a commitment to humanitarian access? Not a doubt in my mind that there is. There wasn't a single operation that I worked on in 12 wars and 25 years where that wasn't there. I think what we're all struggling with is a structure of formation that allows us to work in the most leveraged way to ensure those principles are there. I feel that the discussion about competition, it's always tactical, you're always trying to get more money. But in terms of a level of shared purpose, shared intent, and cooperation, It's pretty exceptional.
We have one over here. Okay, we'll go here then. Right here. Right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was enlightening. It was reflective of experiences that I've also had in certain ways, not in Africa, but in Latin America, Central America. No, I'm not from OCHA, I'm from UNHCR. That's different. we had a very...
We might have a shared view of OCHA. No, I'm kidding.
We might. But it depends on which part of OCHA, when, and under which circumstances.
Of course.
But in any case, UNHCR does have a clear mission, and that's what UNHCR does, and it makes it much easier to know what to do, to be sure. But the problem that at least it affected me, and I'll speak of two countries. One is El Salvador, the other is Colombia.
Yeah.
In both instances, you had armed groups that controlled parts of the country. The government was simply not present. They didn't dare to be present because they had been lost that part of the country. And on the other hand, you had in the US at least, and in many of the countries of the developed world, groups of people who were totally in love with the armed groups that were fighting. In the case of El Salvador, it was the FMLN. In the case of Colombia, the FARC. And these were the heroes, and these were the people that were going to win, and we'll do everything we can to make them win, which made them enemies of the UN humanitarian action and the enemy of many of the humanitarian groups that were trying to be instrumental in solving the situation. And I'm not quite sure how to frame a question out of that, but it was certainly a dilemma, having been told that, having been considered persona non grata by many of the people I thought should be allies. But there are ways around there. There are ways of negotiating with them. How does one deal with the propaganda, not negotiation, that gets in the way of humanitarian action that tries to be targeted and even-handed? Not neutral, even-handed.
So I used an example in Yemen of where Ansar Allah was lying to people that it controlled about what WP was doing. And we had quite a discussion about how to respond to that. Was it of such overriding importance to set the record straight with the population that we would launch a media and engagement campaign for which we had limited resources and limited capabilities because we cared so much about it, we were going to do it anyway, and risk further retaliation from Ansar Allah over that issue, or were we not? And as I said, many of these negotiations are by definition adversarial in nature. The aims of the non-state armed group and the aims of humanitarians almost never coincide. So if you go into negotiations going, right, this is adversarial, then you're going to end up in a situation where you're continually trying to find a solution that favors you. And in order to favor humanitarians in that situation, we did not spend treasure and time in trying to tell the population what the truth was about the situation. That's a judgment call. It may have been a wrong one. I think the key throughput in this is the constant question you have to ask yourself, in this negotiation of an adversarial nature, what can I do that continually tilts the favor to humanitarian access? And if that becomes your compass point, it's probably the best basis to make the decisions and compromises that by definition you're forced to make.
All right. Chartreuse, and then
Hi, sorry, I'll stand so you can see me. Thank you so much for this discussion and those remarks. I have a question about the future. So I do a lot of work in Afghanistan and in Somalia, right? And I've just come from Afghanistan where I was doing a study on sort of principled humanitarian access at the worst possible time one can remember in Afghanistan. And part of my frustration in watching this is I talked to aid workers on the ground who maybe they didn't know neutrality by its name, but they were trying to be neutral, trying to get food to those who needed it most, et cetera, et cetera. But above them, above that frontline level, there's very little capacity to support that. There have been trainings and workshops and so many efforts, but the kind of, for better or worse, the OLS type capacity, the real political, I mean, for lack of a better term, at that level. Of course you have HCs, but they're hostage to the will of agencies and all sorts of things. And so in Somalia as well, it's a very different context. Tough negotiations, a tough armed group to negotiate with. But my sense is that in both of these contexts, with a different system, with a different structure, with a different setup, much, much more can be done. Red lines, JOPs, they don't work for these kinds of contexts. Not in the way, they're not sufficient on their own. I shouldn't be too hard on them. But my question to you is, in light of these kinds of contexts and where things are likely to be headed, which you already touched on, they're going to get tougher. If I gave you a magic wand, what kind of system, what kind of structures at that high level, at the level at which you've operated, how would you build things differently? What do we need to prepare? What should we be investing in?
You know, one of the extraordinary things about Operation Lifeline Sudan is that it was actually negotiated by the head of one UN agency. It was Jim Grant from UNICEF. He was, of course, outside of the country, which addresses the point that you're raising about the tsunami-like pressure that's on an HC. Clearly represented the center of gravity of the international community and was able to persuade, in the middle of a famine, the belligerents that this is what the guardrails look like. I think there's really a role for that. And I think that the emergency response coordinator in New York, the head of the World Food Program, the head of UNICEF, the head of UNHCR, these are extraordinary colleagues with extraordinary capabilities that could be called upon to play this role in contexts like Somalia, so that the HC, who has very little maneuverability politically, gets the space, or in fact shares the responsibility with someone from HQ. I think that probably is going to be much more likely or much more common than it has been for the past 10 years. It's also very important that we rethink two decisions that have been made recently through the IAC processes. One, to move back from L3s. You know, a level 3 humanitarian coordinator was a designation that was given to people who were in a situation like Somalia. It was a designation given to someone who was in Kabul. So we've backed off from that. And I think that's a decision that the IASC could usefully revisit. And then the issue of the secretariat to the HCT. Who is it that pulls together the enormous amount of work that's required to keep these operations going, the role of OCHA? I think it's absolutely worthwhile for the IASC to rethink that and, quite frankly, to renegotiate that arrangement. I think those are three parts of the structure that can, each of those is quite easy to do. They don't require an entire existential shift of humanitarian action. All right, so, I mean, we can all engage in an existential shift in humanitarian action, but that's a very confusing process, a very time-consuming process with a very unpredictable outcome. Right, the outcome could be far worse than what we currently have. What I described are things that can be done really within the existing structure and arguably quite quickly, and that might reinforce the ability of our leadership to do what's necessary.
Okay, Thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me. So first of all, thank you very much for your words. I think for me it was very inspiring, and it's good that you, let's say, look back a bit of a history, because humanitarians, we tend to forget, and we tend to create new tools believing that we are the only ones having the great idea. And to be frank, I was not really aware of all these tools that were developed since the mid-90s. So my name is Hisham Khadarawi. I'm Director of Operations of Geneva Call. We are an NGO that is basically doing what you've just been describing, trying to engage armed groups and securing humanitarian commitments. And I just wanted to raise three really quick points. The first one, you described, I would say, a romantic role of HCs that unfortunately may not exist anymore. I mean, the HC that you described are the textbook HCs, or the ones that maybe you were in Yemen or other colleagues that you may know. But today, I think we're in a different landscape. I was invited at the HC retreat in Montreux, and they invited me to speak about armed groups engagement and negotiations and so on and so forth. And I was surprised, to say the least, to see the little reaction or the little, let's say, appetite to develop this type of, engagement with armed groups. I saw in some of the HCs, no need to name anyone, reluctance based on fear and lack of knowledge. And this was for me a bit striking, because we speak about the top, let's say, UN positions in a given country. So I think there is something to do. I mean, you talk about this small group that was developed in 90s or early 2000s, I don't know. And I think something that needs to be developed in this regard. My second point is there are still a lot of initiatives that are developed by NGOs like us, but many others, and especially by non-traditional actors, elders, religious leaders, people that have vested interest in a given community, that develop dozens of, let's say, agreements that can be informal, that can be in the verses of Quran, in the prayer, let's say, speeches on Friday or anything. And this should not be overlooked, because we may have these top strategic agreements that were developed, the ones that you described, but at the end of the day, on the ground, these type of actions are working. Not maybe at the strategic level, but they are the ones enabling, let's say, access for populations and not for humanitarian actors. I repeat this in many panels where I am. We are not here to secure access for us, but to secure access for people to the basic services. I think this is, for me, an important aspect. So I think it would be interesting to have more inclusivity as well, and localization efforts to let's say, have more analysis from all these let's say, actions that have been done at the local level. And my last point, I loved your point about the piggyback from political negotiators using humanitarian negotiations. I was in Brussels forum last month, and this was said by top leaders in the UN, and I was a bit shocked. So I'm very happy to hear you saying that. Thank you very much.
So the insight that you had about a humanitarian coordinator who is also responsible for a number of other functions in a country, this, of course, was part of the drive to separate the HC functions from other responsibilities at the top level. Most of us who were HCs really didn't want that. And the reason we didn't want that is because when you're negotiating with belligerents, what they really paid attention to was your UNDP function. All right, and the thing that really killed the stature and leverage of the humanitarian coordinator was the RC reform, which separated the RC function from the HC. That's part of the reason why you see what you see. On the question of how you get good HCs, a lot of this, of course, has to do with the way in which the UN leadership understands that role. So when you have UN leadership that understands that role as X, well, the people that get appointed look like X. And if UN leadership understands it as Y, transactional, procedural, then it looks like Y. So the real issue here is how do the member states communicate to the Secretariat of the UN, this is what that role should look like, and then it follows from there. Now, what you were describing about the role of the business community, the church, tribal leaders, in creating, and you put it very well, the reality of assistance and protection, not necessarily of how the club defines that. So of course, this is very similar to the arguments that you're seeing across the UN on networked multilateralism, right? Where you'll have networks of other actors that become part of a broad effort. I think that as global power changes, I think what you're describing is going to be a model that other global leaders than the ones right now are very interested in, and I've heard them say such. So I think you are prescient about where the discussion is going. Now, for the Jesuits amongst us, those of us who say we're humanitarians, who hold the doctrine, who defend that doctrine, this might be very uncomfortable, right? Right? But I think it is almost certainly the wave of the future.
Well, thank you. I deeply apologize. We have no more time for questions, and to the online viewers, I also apologize we did not get to your questions, but thank you, Lise, so much for your time, for this incredible discussion, and I'm sure you've left everyone with a lot to think about and a lot to discuss.
My name's Jay Silva. I am a senior associate here at CSIS on the Global Food Security Program. During the day, you'll find me at the World Food Program USA, which is a nonprofit organization here in Washington, D.C. that supports the mission of the United Nations here in the U.S., or the United Nations World Food Program here in the United States. We've got a great panel lined up for you for this second plenary of the morning, and I'm so glad that we're able to be here all in person, in fact, and not dealing with a little hybrid action this morning, so that's really great. If you are looking for a discussion on food insecurity as a result of access denial in the Horn of Africa, then of course you found yourself in the right spot. Welcome to those online as well. This conversation, of course, is one of many that has occurred over the last few days here at CSIS, and so I want to thank both CSIS and the Norwegian Refugee Council for hosting us the last couple days on this conference on sustaining access. This is the way this panel is going to work this morning. I'll give the panelists a chance to make some introductory comments on the topic and then introduce themselves a little further. I'll do very brief introductions. I've got a handful of questions that I'm hoping to be able to address to the panelists here this morning that will help bring out some of the key themes in this conversation. And then, of course, we'll turn it over to the audience here, both in the room and online, to pick our panelists' brain as well. But before we do that, maybe just a little bit of context for this conversation. You know, the Horn of Africa, of course, as folks are seeing, and it'll be no surprise to folks in this room and online, has experienced 3 consecutive failed rainy seasons. This is the worst hunger crisis in the region for 60 or 70 years. Roughly 80 million people across the Horn are severely food insecure or experiencing food insecurity. Crop yields in a lot of places in the Horn of Africa are down 60 and 70% in affected areas. We've got livestock that are dying. We've got conflict between pastoralists and agricultural communities in this region that is on the rise. Over the past 2 years, of course, Ethiopia has been the sort of poster child of humanitarian access challenges. I think those constraints have improved in recent months, but reaching vulnerable populations across certain parts of that country are still challenging. When, of course, we cannot reach vulnerable populations, there's no safety net, severe hunger, of course, rises. We don't, I don't think, talk much about the way that conflict dynamics are affected when aid is not provided, and so that's part of the reason that we're here today and having this conversation. One plug that I want to make, though, is that we spent a lot of time at the World Food Program USA and at CSIS, Global Food Security Program, thinking about the ways that food insecurity affects instability around the world. I think we've known for a very long time that when you have war and conflict, the inevitable outcome of that is hunger and poverty, but we don't often think about that relationship in the other direction. How are the ways, and in what ways does food insecurity drive instability? There is a new report out on this called Dangerously Hungry, the link between food insecurity and conflict that I encourage you all to take a look at. That's out just this week, and a new commentary out on CSIS, Global Food Security Program, that you can take a look at. While we're talking about the Horn of Africa today, specifically in the panelists, I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge the scale of the global hunger crisis as well, to suggest that these challenges that we're facing in the Horn are unique in terms of access constraints to a certain extent, but the global hunger crisis and the hunger crisis there really is not. There are a multitude of hunger emergencies around the world right now. Latest numbers that we have are 345 million people facing severe hunger. That's IPC 3+, 43 million who are on the edge of famine in IPC 4, and we've got just under 1 million people across half a dozen countries who are experiencing pockets of famine-like conditions. So this is a global crisis of a pretty profound scale. Conflict, of course, represents the single largest driver of hunger today. This is not a surprise to people in this room. And humanitarian organizations, I think, find themselves in a pretty unique situation today. And Lisa drew, I think, some of this out in her conversation this morning in the previous panel, which I encourage you all to check out if you're online. We have seen increases in attacks on humanitarian workers. We've seen, I think just in the last week, the events in Sudan are pretty demonstrative of that. Longer, protracted operations that see humanitarian partners embedded for longer in the political dynamics of a conflict. It makes neutrality, impartiality, and independence more difficult to establish and maintain. And of course, we have new questions about the use of food as a weapon of war that are starting to resonate within the global community. UN Security Council Resolution 2417, I think, sort of advanced that conversation, but we're having more tangible cases of access denial and potential starvation crimes that are happening around the world. So I want to kick us off here and just have Justice Liku make some opening remarks. Justice is the Senior Director for Humanitarian Response at CARE International. He's worked in the food security space for about 15 years, working in regions all around the world. Justice represents CARE on the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Partnership Steering Committee. So Justice, I want you to make just a couple comments, paint the picture of hunger right now in the Horn, and then any comments that you'd like to make opening, and then of course we'll turn to the moderated part of this conversation. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Chase. As Chase mentioned, I'm working for CARE International. I'm based in Nairobi, covering the Horn of Africa region, but my role also goes beyond that. But specifically, I'll be focusing on the Horn of Africa crisis. So, as already mentioned, the Horn of Africa actually is home to more than 44 million people who face acute food insecurity, and where conflict actually is the main driving factor. We have some areas which have population groups actually at the risk of famine, and this can be found in Somalia and Sudan as well. In some of those areas, actually, we have witnessed hunger being used as a weapon of war, where local people are put under siege, their movements are restricted, and they're left to starve. Recent examples are in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, I think which many of you are aware, and also in the Jonglei state of South Sudan. We have had those cases where access to communities becomes very difficult and we are not able to provide humanitarian assistance. Long-lasting conflicts, compounded by political unrest, gender inequality, resource-based conflict, and insecurity are causing population movements, okay, impairing market accessibility and functionality, limiting humanitarian assistance, and preventing access of opportunities for household livelihoods. As we acknowledge that conflict is a leading driver of anger, the vice versa is also happening, where humanitarians have been very vocal highlighting that anger causes conflict too. And we do have some examples of where we have been witnessing that. Rising anger levels have led to grievances that have escalated violence in the region and elsewhere. And I could give examples like in Kenya, in Somalia, in South Sudan. Competition of access to resources like land, water, have resulted to prolonged conflicts with loss of life. We must also note that violence is not limited to rural areas impacted by conflict. It also impacts urban areas where there has been a high growth of population, and also, resources kind of outfacing. The growth of a population outfacing the resources available. And we have also faced economic shocks, which resort to high food prices, increasing food prices. The rising food prices and cost of living has resulted to riots. And we have examples for Kenya. We have examples in Sudan, where people actually have been able to kind of fight against the government because of anger. Poor habits, low incomes, and poor living conditions, either due to drought or forced migration, have made the youth more vulnerable to radicalization and recruitment by the armed forces. We have witnessed that in a number of places where we are working. And that kind of is contributing to escalation of violence. Last year and this year, we have seen increasing food ration cuts in Sudan, in Somalia, leading to increased anger and subsequent conflict in some of those areas. Affected people increase engagement in negative coping mechanisms like skipping meals, begging, child labor, child dropout from school, early marriages, and in certain places also sexual and gender-based violence. A recent study by Plan International in 8 countries, including the Horn of Africa, actually, illustrates how the global food crisis exacerbates the existing gender inequalities, forcing most women, men, girls, and boys, to undertake additional income-generating activities. While women and girls must undertake these activities in addition to their domestic and care responsibilities, men also are, facing pressure as the primary income earners, and this is leading to desperation in most of those communities, which again, kind of in certain places, resorts to violence. I want to focus on what we are doing to address some of these challenges within care. So, despite all these humanitarian access hots, care continues providing essential and life-saving services to the people in need in the region. We have tried to be innovative and creative in doing this to strengthen rather than undermine local institutions and markets. We have partnered with local organizations that can access the hard-to-reach areas. And therefore, where care is not able to reach those people, we work with local partners who are able to access those people and be able to provide assistance. We procure locally where markets allow or where markets are functioning. And we also provide cash assistance to allow people a kind of, to be able to make wider choices of what they can procure. Our food assistance includes also farm inputs, like seeds and tools, as well as animal feed. And this is in an effort to contribute to early recovery for their livelihoods. We have also embraced technology in our programming, mainly so in terms of use of biometrics and also use of voice ID recognition. So some of those places where we can't reach, working with partners, we have been able to pick the voices of the target beneficiaries, and anytime we want to validate whether those are the right people, especially in terms of cash distributions, we are able to connect through mobile phones, and we are able to verify those are the right beneficiaries to be given assistance, and that has been helpful. Let me also mention that care responses are always preceded by a rapid gender analysis to ensure responses are specific to the needs of people, different genders, different ages, as well as mitigating inequalities. CARE has been in the front line in terms of conducting the rapid gender analysis. These are studies we conduct wherever we work, and we share with the bigger humanitarian community for use in programming. Yeah. As I wind up my presentation, we cannot address food insecurity without addressing the myriad of conflict drivers we have already heard about. While diplomatic engagement works to end interstate conflict, still we find small, local, and protracted conflicts over limited resources continue to persist. So we urge the international communities, including public and private donors, to scale up food assistance while also investing in unique approaches to build local capacities, such as technology to improve crop yields, climate adaptation, access to water, greater support to small-scale farmers. These investments build resilience within communities and can even reduce conflict that are often fueled by lack of resources. Addressing these factors concurrently will ease faster the constraints of humanitarian access for people in need of humanitarian assistance, and more so in the Horn of Africa region. Thank you. And to stop there. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Justice. Let's move now to Kwesi Sansculot Greenidge with the World Food Program, and I want to just give a brief bio here for Kwesi so that we can, and he'll allow him to elaborate. But Kwesi is a conflict and access advisor at the World Food Program. There's over 15 years of experience in the policy analysis and governance space, along with a PhD focusing on conflict resolution. So Kwesi, briefly, so we can jump into some more casual conversation, just provide some opening remarks on this access conversation and food-related instability conversation.
Thanks so much, Chase. As Chase has said, my name is Kwesi Sansculot Greenidge. I'm the Access and Conflict Advisor at WFP's office in Nairobi. Now, don't be worried. If you don't know what that job title means, I don't think WFP does either. It's a very, very, very new role. So a couple of caveats before I start. I think firstly is that I usually start off speaking in a British accent and end in a Guyanese accent. So as I become less intelligible, somebody please just wave your hand so I know when to switch between the two.
I'll do that for you.
Lovely, lovely. I'd like to pick up a couple threads that Justice started with here. And I guess the question for me sitting on this panel and when I got the invitation was, why the Horn of Africa? So we've spoken a little bit about Ukraine yesterday, we've spoken about the Sahel yesterday, but we keep coming back to the Horn of Africa for a number of reasons. And this is because it's a region in transition. As Justice mentioned, it's a region that's going through a number of different transitions at the same time. It's going through a demographic transition. It's going through a transition from rural into urban. Now, the Horn of Africa was one of the areas that had the lowest levels of urbanization 30 years ago. Now it's one of the most rapidly urbanizing. It's a region that's going through a number of political transitions where states are tearing each other and their neighbors apart in terms of what it is to be governed by the state. Are we going for federal models? Are we going for centralized models? Now, in many other countries, these transitions have taken place, but they've taken place either in secession or they've taken place over a period of incredibly long amounts of time. In the Horn, they're trying to undergo all of these transitions at the same time. On top of that, these transitions are compounded by challenges around climate change, around food insecurity, and around conflict. We've got our own triple nexus, as we heard yesterday, only this is a quite horrible nexus. In terms of, just from a bird's eye view, in terms of the numbers, we've had an increase of around 37% of those who are food insecure in the Horn of Africa. So we've gone from somewhere around 43 million last year to around 67 million people food insecure this year in the Horn. The vast majority of those are people who have been either displaced within their home countries or across borders due to conflict. Some 87% of those in need in the Horn of Africa were conflict-related last year. The numbers aren't quite out yet for this year, but it's likely to be just as high. What does this mean for a food security agency like WFP, and what does this mean for humanitarians on the whole? Well, it means that we need to be smarter in the work that we do. I think Justice has highlighted some of the new interventions that are being put into place to allow us to be smarter in the work we do. The challenge for us, of course, is that, as was highlighted in the panel before us by Liz Grande, is that we've got a number of challenges around access. Now, while Liz spoke incredibly eloquently about the failures of the UN system, the lack of capacity within our RCs and HCs in some cases, and the challenges we face with non-state armed groups, one of the largest issues that we face in terms of reaching those in need and preventing greater levels of food insecurity are actually in many cases state actors in the Horn of Africa. We've got a number of conflicts where parties to the conflict, including states who are signatories to a number of agreements and know better, have been the largest obstacles to reaching those in need. The situation in Tigray in Ethiopia is one that the UN Humanitarian Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, called a stain on the human conscience and a living nightmare. It was a situation in where a state actor blocked the United Nations from providing assistance to millions over an extended period of time. We've got a situation, an access situation or access challenges in Somalia, caused not only by non-state armed groups' denial of access to civilians, but also an inability to reach them due to poor infrastructure, due to challenges of that nature. How then do we, as humanitarians, not only reach those populations, but reach them in a sustained manner that allows them to receive humanitarian assistance? One of the ways, of course, is improving our capacity in terms of access negotiations, in terms of access skills, and in terms of principled approaches to dealing with parties that hold populations hostage or that use humanitarian assistance for political means. How do we do that, I think, is something we'll come into in the follow-up round, but for the opening, these are just some of the challenges that we face in our neck of the woods, the Horn of Africa, and some of the problems and challenges I think that we're all grappling with as humanitarian actors in this space. Just to close, I think I was speaking with Justice in the back. I actually started my career some 20 years ago working on Darfur, and thought at that point in time that this is perhaps the nadir that we can get to in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of access. It's always a risk to think that you've gotten as low as you can, because there's always somebody to prove you wrong. And what we're seeing is a number of state and non-state actors now that are pushing back against collective norms that together we have held dear for the last 75 to 80 years. And we've seen an inability by the political, as mentioned by Liz, in terms of trying to put the onus on us as humanitarians, a failure of the political system, but also the humanitarian system to hold those actors to account. We lack the tools as the UN because we're a state-based organization. And at times we lack the space and we lack the alliances that would allow us to reach those in need, but also to hold those accountable. And this is where 2417, UN Resolution 2417, becomes so important. But I think I'll stop there for the opening salvo, and we can come back to some of these issues in the other rounds.
Great. Christine Gottschalk, let's move over to you now. I think you can provide some, a little higher level context for us. Christine, of course, is the Director, Center for Resilience, Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. You've held that position since 2018. You began your career with USAID in 2002. You've been involved in a variety of emergencies around the world, including Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, and a variety of other places. You really sit at this nexus of humanitarian development and sort of security conversations. Also served from 2015 to 2016 as a Director for Humanitarian Assistance on the National Security Council. So over to you for some opening remarks and maybe provide us a little bit of context from the donor side of things.
Thank you. It's certainly humbling to be here. I think as USAID, we really rely on all of our implementing partners. And you all really are the ones that are on the front lines. And I don't know, I have a lot of experience on the humanitarian side for the last 5 years or so, I've been on the development side of USAID. I'm just curious how many development practitioners we have in the room. All right, we've got one. My office really does sit on this this line between our humanitarian development and our peace programming, and it's a challenging place. I think really where we see the most inroads in terms of how we really think about this nexus, it's really in kind of hyper-local responses. But that said, I do think as we look at staggering levels of food insecurity, primarily driven by conflict and climate, we're also learning a lot more about the dynamics between conflict and food insecurity. Justice and Kwesi shared some already on this, but when conflict strikes, it disrupts agriculture and food systems. Farmers can't plant, they can't travel to markets. We see people coping in some of the really dangerous ways that Justice highlighted in his remarks. It means there's a selling off of assets so that even when there is some stability and opening in peace somewhere, the starting point for recovery is really set far back. And then at the same time, food insecurity can drive conflict as well. It can drive and motivate recruitment by different groups, and it just becomes a really awful cycle that really makes it difficult to push towards our prospects towards well-being, maintaining well-being, as well as prospects towards peace. And then food systems play just a really critical role before, during, and after conflict. The link between food insecurity and conflict is really prominent, particularly when we see prices spike, as we have this past year, where we've seen an already bad situation, particularly in the Horn. We see this playing out, exacerbated by inflation. And exacerbated by increasing competition over natural resources. Land disputes, access to markets, local corruption can also they promote both food insecurity and conflict alike. And then during conflict, farmers can be targeted for their food assets, and people lose access to food and markets. We provide really important assistance, but most people rely on local markets to get what they need. So that's just a really critical thing for all of us to keep in mind. And then also one aspect that we haven't mentioned yet, but I'm sure you all see in your work, is agriculture, armed conflict, and forced displacement. They're all really highly gendered in their nature. So in addition to conflict sensitivity in our programming and our responses, we really also need to be thinking at the same time about gender-sensitive programming and what that means for exacerbating gender inequality, and how do we find some unique ways to really address the different needs of men, women, boys, girls. Justice also mentioned a couple of these things and some of the different pressures that they're seeing in their programming. And this also means doing the analysis and understanding about who's excluded and why, and really looking at how we can then use that to mitigate those dynamics. And then just lastly, we're talking and thinking a lot about hunger, how hunger exacerbates conflict, but I think it's also important to be thinking about where in the food system we have opportunities to. When we think about strengthening food systems, and really think about ways and how we can benefit the poor and the vulnerable, we're really helping to promote stability. And, you know, thinking about access to markets, inclusion in those systems and approaches, it can decrease some of the inequality across ethnic groups. And it can be a place, too, where we can look at ways to create new connections and see how we can build trust across groups. I'm sure many of you have some examples of this. There's a great example from DRC where Feed the Future economic growth activities were really integrated with some peace-building activities that really helped build trust between groups and reduce the tension and resulted in a greater income for households and the community. And then there's, I think, unique things we can do around community land trusts that also can help with building trust and negotiating agreements between farmers and pastoralists that can ease tensions over natural resources, and looking at ways we use extension services, livestock extension services, to help to build trust between citizens and their governments. Just really thinking about some of those food security, food system investments that we make with a kind of a peace-building, stability-building lens to them. And I'll pause there for now, and I think it would be, in the discussion, great to kind of get into where we can lean in as humanitarian actors and as development actors into this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I want to move back to justice now. And there's something that I think came up in both your and Kwesi's opening comments, which is this question of urbanization. You know, when I sort of grew up and cut my teeth in the food security space, hunger was always considered a rural phenomenon. And I think this is a new dynamic that we're seeing, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, that pushed huge numbers of urban poor into hunger, and the sort of face of hunger has fundamentally changed. So I kind of want to put a pin in that, and if anybody wants to comment in their remarks on the urbanization of hunger and how that might affect access constraints, I'd be interested to have that conversation. But justice specifically, something else, when we think of food assistance and food aid access constraints in places like the Horn of Africa, we're often thinking about trucks stopped at borders or checkpoints, you know, the sort of really tangible access constraint questions. You talked a little bit in your opening remarks about the variety of assistance that CARE is providing, and some of it cash-based assistance. Talk about whether cash-based assistance or different modalities of assistance are less conflict sensitive or more conflict sensitive, and maybe the importance of telecommunications and banking infrastructure in those places, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Jess. Let me relate to what Kay is doing in Somalia, where the conflict has kept on changing over time, and we have to keep on adapting our programming system. One of the things we have adopted is, as I mentioned, working with the partners who are connected to the communities. But that does not mean that working with those local leaderships, that doesn't mean that you really still have access to the communities themselves, not really. Communities who have been affected by conflict are always very sensitive. And therefore, anyone coming outside or even assistance, they look at it with, they're serious and they want to know what is happening. So let me say access negotiations always starts with the communities. You need to create trust at that particular level. The leadership of the communities you are supporting, you have to create a rapport with those communities. They have to trust you and they have to be able to work with you. And that also works with the partners we work with also. You know, you have to show that you value their services, you value them as a partner, and you trust them. And it's out of those relationships we tend to build, to strengthen them, such that for them also to understand our values, and such that even if we are not there, but we can be sure our values are being applied. But in addition to that, we want to apply other filters above that not only trusting and believing, but we are doing things in a manner where we can be able to verify that actually those who need actually get the support. And that is how we are partnered with telecommunication companies like Telesom in Somalia. We have built what I was mentioning, the Voice ID application. And what we do, when we are doing beneficiary identification, we record the beneficiary voices. It's unique to everyone. It's unique to everyone. And therefore, when we pick those voices, then anytime we are providing resources, we can use those, we can communicate to that person and verify, actually, that is the right person. When we do that, then that is connected to already to the transfers we do, like the cash transfers. So we are able to do the transfers to those communities without interacting with them, but with confidence that the process we have used is actually they are the ones who are receiving the assistance. So these are some of the things which we have innovated, and especially they are working for us, especially when we are doing cash transfers. And therefore, we are able to reach people whom we can't see, and we are able to transfer, support to them. You mentioned about also the issues of the big convoys we used to have, food coming from places. A number of times, because of the time that food might take, or even when we have it in our stores, getting to the communities becomes a bit difficult. And therefore, what we have done is also, again, kind of making connections with the local traders. We are able to map out to know where they have stocks of different things. And we are able to have those contracts in advance, pre-contracts, in advance with some of those traders, such that if this happens, then you will be able to supply us with if it's serious or whatever, and the prices and everything is already negotiated. Even the logistics of how to do things is already negotiated. And therefore, with those particular contacts then, we are able to reach the communities within a shorter time and be able to provide assistance. Let me also say that the way we work with WFP, we work with other organizations like UNICEF. We have also made a bit of arrangements where we can pick resources from whichever agency has and be able to provide it where there are needs in a quicker way, other than waiting for resources to come from the capital to reach the local level for us to be able to provide it. Let me stop there. Yeah.
Kwesi, you made a comment in your opening that I think was made in jest, but that's really quite interesting, which is, I don't know that WFP knows what my title means just yet. Is there an issue in the humanitarian sector in terms of the conflict awareness and conflict sensitivity of humanitarian actors within organizations like WFP? We talk about the ways that assistance, international food assistance or food assistance can contribute to these conflict zones or complicate these things. It's inherently a political dynamic that's impossible to escape from. But talk about whether organizations like WFP and what steps are taking to sort of increase the visibility of conflict sensitivity of your work.
I think that's a great question and perhaps a bad joke that may cost me my job, but let's see. Let's see what happens when I get back to Nairobi. I think it's a very interesting position for large operational humanitarian organizations like WFP. When I joined WFP a year ago from the Secretariat, I told my regional director, I don't know anything about trucks. I don't know where the carburetor is. I can drive a stick shift, barely, but I know nothing. I don't know what a ton looks like. And they still took me on because I think that WFP, as well as a number of other organizations, are trying to make that jump into the triple nexus. They are a largely humanitarian actor that has a strong development footprint, but is also trying to understand where can their humanitarian assistance improve peace at the local level. Now, there are differences within the organization as to whether that should be P with a capital P, whether it should be negotiations between armed actors, whether it should be large-level peace-building activities, or whether this should be P with a small p, and that is what we call the everyday peace, which is us working to build social cohesion in our local communities. To kind of contextualize this for us and give us some ideas to where we need to be looking, we commissioned last year a review of our 10-year-old peace-building strategy. And what this review came out with was actually quite interesting. One, it stated some of the obvious, that there is a value in providing food security to populations that reduces their likelihood of engaging in conflict. Now, it's not a direct causal link in the same way that there's no direct causal link between climate change and conflict. It's a very, it's a very long pathway that leads to that. But what the report found was that WFP's contribution to small p really lies in two areas. First is in building social cohesion at the local level through community engagement, particularly around distribution and infrastructure. The second part of it said that the organization is trying to, but still has to put more effort into being conflict sensitive. It needs to move from a very strong base of do no harm, which we have now, up the ladder into conflict sensitivity if it wanted to actually contribute into positive peace. And I think this is where you see positions like mine, access advisors, conflict advisors, or those combined, is the organization and the UN system as a whole trying to understand the impact that it has on conflict, but also the role it can play in peace building. If 87% of our beneficiaries are conflict related, then unless we're able to address the root causes of these conflicts, we will forever be dealing with symptoms rather than the causes of the problems that we have in the Horn of Africa. The only other point to mention here is that a lot of this work now is combined with our work on climate security, because we also see a very intricate link between conflict, food insecurity, and the effects of climate change. Not directly causal, but what you have is that climate change weakens systems of resilience, weakens systems of social protection, and where you have countries that are already fragile because of either conflict, because of either corruption, as mentioned before, or because of weak governance systems, the climate shock can be that one extra shock that pushes these countries, these communities, these people over the edge. So what is our responsibility as humanitarians? What is our responsibility as WFP to ensure that we're shock-proofing these development gains that the countries have had, countries and communities have had over the last 20 years?
Christine, can you build off just a little bit of what Kwesi said there about climbing up the ladder from do no harm? You know, what are the things that organizations and donors like USAID, what can you do to support those efforts right at that humanitarian development peace nexus? You said, you know, you might have a couple examples of something in practice.
I do think do no harm's the starting point, and then where we build from there. I think it is really important, and we are increasingly really trying to do much better with all of you as our implementing partners. Real-time analysis of information and really understanding the context. You know, that continuous context monitoring with really extra attention to inclusivity, the in and out groups, and what that means for the conflict is really critical. And really looking at really how we can ensure that, you know, as we're thinking about conflict sensitivity, whether you're doing a humanitarian program, something that's more developmental in nature, really looking at how we can seek peace dividends. And oftentimes that's really a very hyper-local response. That we might, you know, there could be savings groups or women's groups that are frustrated with the dynamics on the ground and seeking to come together. I think taking those sometimes small windows of opportunity and then looking at how we can use our programmatic resources to start to change the dynamic. I do think also it's really, really important and to be jointly planning. We all have our stovepipes. I work in a big bureaucracy. Kwesi works in a big bureaucracy. We all have our stovepipes, but it can be really powerful when we bring our different actors together, our humanitarians, our peace builders, our development actors, to really look at joint problem analysis and really thinking about what it means to be solving that problem, not from our water perspective, our food perspective, but to be thinking about that problem and then lining up what different resources and expertise we bring to bear. I think that is something that we have seen can be very powerful and can help flip the dynamic a bit in our own approach to how we're doing our assistance. I think we also focus a lot on risks and vulnerability. It is important that we understand that. It's equally important that we understand capacities. What are the strengths here? We're talking about really resilient communities. So how can we capitalize on areas of social cohesion? How can we look at ways that we are increasing people's own sense of agency in our international response? I think, and this really is very context specific. I think, for one example or different example from DRC, like in Somalia, we have much better overlap now than in past years with our development food security programs, and where IDPs are typically moved to in drought crises. And these longer-term food security programs are also helping to increase local food fortification. They're helping local actors sell their food, not just on the local market, but to humanitarian organizations. So I think just really thinking creatively about sometimes small changes in what we're doing to help start to shift the dynamic.
Justice, I think at the panel this morning with Lisa from USIP, we talked a lot about the sort of broader context that is required to set the stage for the individual negotiations that you play at the micro level to gain access to communities. How important are those higher level breakthroughs, whether they are establishment of corridors or ceasefires or joint operating plans? And how's that process improved in your mind?
I want to say that they're very important, and a very recent one is the Ukraine-Russia breakthrough for us to be able to move commodities from there to to our regions. Before that, our prices had gone very high, and access to food was a huge challenge because a number of countries like Somalia, much of what they consume still comes from that region in terms of wheat. And therefore, that negotiation, even if it was so far, at a different level, but it was also very important for us as humanitarians in terms of meeting the needs in our regions. So that is one thing where, then it becomes easy for us as a community to be able to get the resources to be able to move them to. But then let me bring it to local, where you are saying, I give an example of already we mentioned about Ethiopia and the Tigray situation and the negotiations which have been happening at the government level. And from time to time, we were able to get some kind of a period where we are able to move things, like in terms of move cash, move commodities, move medicine for healthy clinics to the communities. So this is important. When we have such breakthroughs, then we are able to move stocks closer to the people. And even if we were not available, then they will be able to access them. So both at, call it international, and you can bring it at regional, national, and then you go to the community level. I think some of these negotiations giving us opportunities to be able to move things closer to the communities for them to access them always is very, very important in our work and what we do. Again, under such circumstances, as I was mentioning, if you are working with good local organizations, government hospitals, any times of difficulties, we are able to stock more near the communities. It's not necessarily that as care we will have this, the storage facilities, But as community, there is a way we work with also the government to be able to put stocks closer to the communities. Especially, let me say, a number of places where CARE works on the health sector, we work very closely with the government institutions, the healthy clinics. And we normally support them in terms of stocking medicine and all that. And therefore, at times of difficulties, things are accessible to the communities. Yeah.
Kwesi, I saw you scribbling furiously over there. Do you want to comment as well on the sort of layered, cascading effect of diplomatic breakthroughs that sort of make them way all the way to your local negotiations from WFP?
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting question. So in WFP, we've got a number of approaches and partnerships to help when those breakthroughs happen. So at the grassroots level, we've partnered with NRC in terms of getting our staff training as frontline access negotiators, so that when there is a breakthrough, they can get in there quickly. They understand what humanitarian principles are. They understand the rules around IHL. We're also trying to roll this out also for what WFP calls their cooperating partners. So these are what everybody else calls implementing partners, so that they also understand these principles and can also do this. Now, this is not to make them negotiators or access negotiators, but in some places, it's so that they understand the lingo, they understand the challenges, they know when they're at a point of a red line and need to step back and call for help. So this has been incredibly useful for us. We've also got partnerships with a number of other groups to provide technical assistance at a higher level, like CCHN and others out there to provide negotiation and mediation skills for our senior leadership. The challenge, of course, is that when you have a situation like, for instance, Ethiopia, where a belligerent party has taken a decision that's actually a military decision, that their military strategy will be to block assistance to an entire region or to an ethnic group or to a political party's home base, there are very limited tools that you have as a humanitarian. And I think this is something that both Liz and Jan spoke about yesterday and today. We have a limited array of tools. What we do have is a number of partners who we can call on, bilaterals, to help move the situation forward. But as Jan said earlier, in today's world, the partners that humanitarians have are largely Western partners. The countries where we encounter these challenges are countries where these Western partners may not have influence or may have economic interests that mean that they may not be willing to use all of the tools available to them. So the question becomes, what partnerships are needed by humanitarian actors that allow you to move the dial on these issues of humanitarian access blockages? And I don't think we're there yet as a humanitarian community where we have all of the tools we need to move that. I think we have a number of countries, not only in the Horn of Africa, but globally, that show that we're not there yet. Whether we can build consensus with partners and like-minded states like the Irish, like others who've led on 24/17 over the last 2 years during their time at the Security Council is a question. What would a partnership like that look like? What would a partnership like that look like for humanitarians, many of whom are very nervous about being engaged in anything that they would consider remotely political? But then how do you move the dial in a political conflict or in a political situation when humanitarian access may be traded, as was mentioned by Liz, by political leads who can't get any traction? So then they use humanitarian openings and humanitarian assistance either as confidence-building measures or as first steps to political settlement. So these are very, very tough questions that humanitarian actors are dealing with on the ground, both at the grassroots level, but also at the level of their capitals and their global leads. Is how do we find this balance between needing to get to populations who need assistance, but understanding that we're dealing with actors who many times don't share either an understanding or a willingness to implement rules around humanitarian neutrality, respect for IHL, and things of that nature. So it's a tough place that we find ourselves in.
Right. Well, let's get the room involved. If folks have questions, there will be roving mics moving around. If there are questions online as well, I've got a trusty iPad here that will send those to me. So please, if you're online and want to address a question to Christine, Justice, or Kwesi, please do that as well. So let's go to the room first here, please.
Thank you. This was a very enlightening and an encouraging panel, despite all the depressing context in which it's staged, because everybody seems to be trying to figure out what's the best way, the best strategy, and the best route. I want to accept Chase's invitation to talk about urbanization in this context, because it is such an important factor in peacekeeping and in humanitarian action. It's clear that people are urbanizing at an enormous rate, and that many of the organizations that used to serve these same people serve them in rural areas, and still have the idea that people who go to cities want to return to these rural areas. And that's proved not true. The people come to cities, this is my own research and I won't spend any time on it, but they come to cities that are ill-prepared to receive them, and with institutions that are not equipped to work with the humanitarian agencies to a large extent. It's hard to figure out what is the local community in an urban area. On the other hand, the positive thing, almost all of the interventions that the panel mentioned were interventions, health interventions, educational interventions, food distribution mechanisms. They're all more easily delivered in an urban area. And I would like you to comment, if you would. Well, also, Christina spoke fleetingly of efforts to unite the two so that people don't have to choose, I will be urban or I will be rural, but I will work in between. There's agricultural alternatives that can use rural knowledge to feed urban areas, and people can work on both sides, urban and rural, and not make that horribly difficult decision. So I'd like you to speak, if you don't mind, in terms of the Horn of Africa or wherever, in terms of those strategies. Thank you.
Anybody want to jump in first?
I'd like to take a stab at that one. I think I agree totally with the question. So what we're seeing in urbanization, particularly in the Horn, is the best and worst of both worlds. So you have got all the poor services of a bustling, up-and-coming city or peri-urban environment, but with none of the social safety nets of the countryside. So you're finding that large groups of population are both betwixt and between. Lack of access to services, but not the safety nets that they need. And I think this is why so much of the work that's being funded by USAID, implemented by partners like WFP and CARE around social protection becomes so important. Little beknownst to many, a lot of our work, both humanitarian and our development work, for instance, in Somalia, is 90% cash-based. 90% in a situation like Somalia. That's because if anybody has been to Somalia, they have some of the best mobile and internet services there anywhere in the world that you'd find. I guess it's a plug for small government, or no government. They have some incredible cell providers who are able to get assistance and cash transfers to populations deep in rural areas. So the question becomes then, how do we leverage what we've learned over the last 20 years as humanitarian actors, largely focused in rural areas? How do we leverage that in these new peri-urban and urban settings? Because one of the challenges that we're facing in the Horn, and I'll close on this, with the great drought in East Africa, which is now entering its 6th failed rainy season or something crazy like that, is that in the past, 100 years ago, people would have simply taken the land of their neighbors. Now we don't allow that anymore. So what they're doing is they're moving to these urban environments where they're not getting the services they need. So then how do we jig our humanitarian, how do we jig our development work to work seamlessly together to ensure that these new urban populations get access to these social safety nets and these social services? These are some of the issues that we're struggling with, or some of the challenges that we're trying to deal with as WFP in the Horn as it relates to both climate change and urbanization.
Maybe I can also add, specific to food security. Our tools have tended to be focused on making assessments at rural areas, but we don't have very good tools in terms of doing assessments in urban areas. And therefore, when we start talking about food insecurity in the urban communities, again, it becomes a bit complex for us, like how do we touch it? But as organizations, I think the entry we have found is like the social safety nets. I think we have done well in terms of trying to interact with the urban communities and trying to see how we can be able to support them. I think we have also done very well in terms of the education interventions and also the health interventions. I mean, if I can say from care perspective, we've been working in a number of slum areas, in Nairobi and in other locations. And also, not even that, where we have also, displaced communities, the structures have almost, developed to be urban status. I think we have also become very good in terms of entry, but from development sectors, not so much from a humanitarian perspective. And as already mentioned, I think we have a challenge. We have to build ourselves to be able to deal with the urban situations. Yeah.
Please.
Just add a note on climate adaptation. It is an integral part of our longer-term resilience work, and I think it's a really important piece to be thinking about and considering in our shorter-term humanitarian efforts as well. We are, in the Horn, we are seeing particularly youth drop out of pastoralism, other forms of agriculture, and that is happening naturally. They're moving to towns and urban areas. So really thinking about those job opportunities and more positive job opportunities, and just how paying very close attention to the economies and how they are changing. And when we're thinking about how we approach stability, that political economic analysis is just so essential, and there's no easy answer, right? But I do think it takes some longer term thinking about where our humanitarian assistance fits within that longer term picture of economic opportunity as well. And that's what's going to help bring some greater stability too.
We've got a question in the back of the room, and then I'm going to turn to the online questions that we have available.
Thanks, and thanks to the panel. Really great discussion, and really important, I think, that you chose to focus on the Horn of Africa very specifically. And Christine, I think climate is now coming into the title of the Bureau, which I think is a reflection of the synergies and the complications of what we're all trying to achieve, and I think that's very welcome. There was one brave soul that's put his hand up and said he was the only sole development person in the room, although I think in truth many of us are dual mandated organisations, so probably we should have joined. But it's on that, and Chrissy, maybe your last point around job opportunities and employment going hand in hand. We know that the humanitarian sector is overwhelmed, overstretched and underfunded, and is being asked to do more than its capacity allows. We also know that we've seen some shifts, but they're not very significant, with the World Bank, UNDP and others towards operating within that space in terms of resources and in terms of everything else, but not sufficiently. And I do think it's telling that, we tend to talk to ourselves in relation to this. And I don't know how we can get the development sector, donors, whatever, much more involved. You talk about risk, and yet I think that's where they're going to have to start making more significant risks, particularly in the context we're working in. So whether you have any suggestions or advice about how that can happen, that would be helpful.
That's the $1 million question. No, billion, few $1 billion question. I think we have as a development donor, we have increased our development resources in recent years to areas of recurrent crisis. Food security has really been kind of the starting point for that, and have been gradually increasing our longer-term Feed the Future resources, getting greater alignment with the non-emergency resilience food security activities that our Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance implements, that is also in part resourced by my bureau. but then also really trying to crowd in some of the other development resources as well, environment, health, education, really critical to the human capacity and assets that people carry with them. You know, it is, we're about a decade into that effort. I think the Horn we see, the sixth failed rainy season, those efforts, I think, you know, they've shown and we've learned what we can do, but they're not at a scale. They were not at a scale to weather 6 failed rainy seasons. But I do think we can take some of the practices and look at where we now move forward from here. You know, for Kenya, even with the magnitude of this drought, the government of Kenya responded much earlier to this drought than they did in 2011, in 2016, 2017. We have seen far fewer livestock deaths, and we've seen less impact on their GDP. So it is grim, yet we have seen it can make a difference. So I think, again, it's really looking at how do we continue to move forward in this space. Kwasi mentioned social protection. This is an area where I think we really do have an opportunity to bring together development and humanitarians, even around something like social registries, so that it makes that early response earlier and more effective. And it can play a key role in really, I think, bringing together actors on both sides.
Anybody else want to comment on the sort of humanitarian development nexus, or should we move on? Christine, you're sort of coming across here as a bit of a novelty, representing the development community in a sea of humanitarian folks here. So I've got a question for you online here. This person asks, can you speak a bit more on the consideration of gender in food and nutrition assistance programming, particularly on the expectations and actions of a mother in a household? She asks further, can we really trust the data on who is receiving assistance, particularly when we know that mothers are likely to give food and nutrition assistance to children? Maybe take the first half of that in terms of elaborating on the gender dynamics of the programming you do at USAID.
So we know, and you all see in your programs, women and children are the most heavily impacted by the global food crisis. They've been the most heavily impacted by the inflationary shocks of the past year, because they also are the least likely to have access to financing, to credit, to other assets, or the ability to accrue assets. In all of our programming, we really are trying to pay much closer attention to the targeting. We've done a lot around financial inclusion to also really look at women and youth and trying to close some of that financing gap. And oftentimes, it's filling gaps for micro and small enterprises, not just small and medium enterprises, but really those micro and small enterprises. In northern Kenya, we set up an evergreen impact fund to start to bring more capital up into the ASAL regions. One of the lenders that is a part of that partnership saw that there's opportunity there, and they're using their own resources to set up additional branches. You know, I think there are ways we can, really look at how we're targeting women. It's often women who run small businesses that are then hiring other women. So I think there's many things like that we can be doing. We have actually just announced a new program called GROW. I'm forgetting the acronym right now, but it is really about improving food security outcomes for women, and really intentionally targeting women across our programming. And I would also say, I think all of us, this is the broad we all need to do a much better job of gender disaggregating our data. We can do it, we should be doing it, but sometimes we still aren't. And unless we have that data to inform our learning, it's going to really challenge us to continue to see how we need to be adapting our programs.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience here. We're wrapping up, coming into 5 minutes to go. All the way in the back, please. Yes, if we can get a roving mic over there.
Thank you, Silvana Failace, Church World Service. I think I'm the third development person in the room. We are in North Marsabit right now in Kenya, delivering food rations. But one thing Church World Service does is that to bring in together the development humanitarian nexus, we make our own investments to stay in communities further to the acute phase of an emergency. And we stay with our own funds or with private funds or individual funds. We're trying to change big donors' minds that those investments are necessary because we wait for communities to tell us what they need in the long term. So we're doing that in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, as well as in Haiti after the recent earthquake in Pastel, but also in these communities in northern Kenya. So the importance there is to actually have a fully localized approach and really think of investing also in local organizations that will stay there also in the long term. It does require rethinking about how donor funds flow come, particularly big institutional donors that have broader access to larger amounts of funding that maybe smaller organizations will not have. So it does require a little bit of rethinking, but we're doing it also in Moldova with a Ukraine refugee response, where it's staying beyond the initial acute crisis. So it does require a sort of corporate commitment to staying with communities beyond the acute phase. So I just wanted to add that for the previous comment. Thank you.
Great. We had another question in the back of the room as well, if we want to, that's close by. Right in front of the previous question.
Thank you. I'm going to keep my question short for the sake of time. This question is both for Kwesi and Justice and our colleague from USAID. You've used the terms social protection, resilience, climate impact, and climate protection in the humanitarian space, but speaking also as the development person, those are common elements that you hear in long-term development projects. So within the space of food security and climate security, I'd like to know from you three, where do you see the line between development and humanitarian? Our colleague from USAID, perhaps you could speak from the donor and the funder side, and our other two colleagues, perhaps you could speak from an implementation side, where you see that line and if that line exists.
Who wants to go first?
Maybe I can go first. I think it's very difficult to put a line. That is what we have observed in CARE, and I think with also the donors, much of the funding now you will find it's providing us those opportunities when we have a development program to slide back to, kind of attend to any humanitarian assistance which is happening, and the vice versa. So what we do is that any kind of humanitarian intervention, we are trying to integrate some recovery activities. And we already talked about like the big WAP program about building community assets and the training aspects so that the communities can be able. We also, like I was mentioning, that you just don't provide the food assistance alone, but you combine with providing seeds, animal feed, so that you can link them to the livelihood recovery opportunities. And therefore, what I can say good with the donors is that flexibility where we have a development program and we are able to immediately switch funds to humanitarian work. And again, end of humanitarian work, we are able to switch to development work. So I think it's very difficult to put a line here.
I think I'll pick up where Justice left off. So that line on the ground doesn't exist. But in reality, it does exist in the ledger books of some of the donors and bilateral partners. Of course, not USAID, but with others. So the challenge that you have there is the ability to move funds between these two silos. So in many times, funding is earmarked specifically for humanitarian action and not for anticipatory action. So if you wanted to do something like crop insurance, you wanted to do something like livestock insurance, you wanted to provide pastoralists with information around when the rains will come, how good or bad they would be, should you sell some of your livestock now rather than risk losing it all, that funding is in the decimal points compared to the humanitarian funding. Now, part of that is the way the donors are set up. Some of that is the way the UN is set up to receive some of the funding. But we've got an imbalance to the tune of, I think, 83% of funding goes within WFP East Africa goes to humanitarian action. A much smaller amount goes to our development portfolio, and then less than 3% goes towards anticipatory action. So when you have an imbalance that's that glaring, you do have a line, but the problem is that the line exists at a very high level, but on the ground, you're trying to pigeonhole funding and programming in ways that allow you to basically work across this nexus. Many of the donors are getting better, particularly some of the smaller donors that have flexible funding. But what we really need is for some of our larger partners to have that flexibility too, that will allow us to move funding across these three pillars, but particularly towards anticipatory action.
Christy, I'm going to spare you on this answer, just given the fact that we're at time. But if you want to make one short comment, I'm really happy to do it.
Comment. I think I would put the safety net transfers in the humanitarian space. The things I would put more on the development are the asset protection, index insurance, crop insurance, livestock insurance, and we do some investing to help encourage and incentivize governments to purchase sovereign insurance. I put those in the longer term.
Great. Well, thank you all for the questions in the room here. Thanks for the folks who have tuned in online and provided your questions. We're going to wrap up here. Thanks again to Justice and Kwesi and Christine. Thank you very much.